United States want from tightening the sanctions? I mean, it's even beyond tightening the sanctions now.
Indeed it is. The United States government has created an artificial crisis. That's first and foremost. It's a manufactured crisis. Iran is complying with the IAEA. Iran does not have a nuclear weapon. Iran is not threatening its neighbors. Iran has not started a war with any of its neighbors. Israel, on the other hand, has hundreds of nuclear weapons, and unlike Iran, refuses to sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, does not allow IAEA inspectors into its country. So there's not really a nuclear menace or a nuclear danger from Iran. So what is the cause? What's the cause of the crisis, of the artificial crisis? The real goal is the United States government has embarked on a course of extreme economic aggression against Iran with the hope that by creating economic suffering, economic isolation, economic misery, that part of the population will rise up or become disenfranchised with the government so that the U.S. can do, as it has in history, carry out regime change.
They denied that. The U.S. denied that it's trying to carry out a regime change in Iran.
Right. I mean, we have to take that with a very, very big grain of salt, because we know that since 1979, the United States refuses to have relations with the Islamic Republic of Iran. Why? Is it because Iran is a dictatorship? Well, it's actually a democratic government. It has democratic features far beyond some of America's foremost allies in the Middle East, such as Saudi Arabia, for instance. Since 1979, Iran became an independent government. Before that, between 1953 and 1979, when the Shah was there, the Shah acted basically as a proxy or a puppet or a client of the American power. And so the U.S. says they're not carrying out regime change, but in fact, everyone who's watching knows that indeed is the U.S. policy, to create pressure on Iran, carry out covert operations, economic sanctions, and now these new sanctions are not really even like the old sanctions. They are saying to the rest of the world, if you dare do business with Iran's central bank, if you buy Iranian oil, which constitutes half of Iran's GNP, if you have any business with Iran whatsoever, you will not have access to American banks, to American corporations, to the American market. This is, in fact, a blockade, something like an economic blockade of Iran. And by international law, an economic blockade is an act of war. And so we should understand it just like that.
So what do you think Iran's response is going to be?
Well, Iran so far has been very prudent. Even though they said that they would consider closing the Strait of Hormuz, that 6-mile stretch of the Persian-Arabian Gulf, where 25% of the world's oil supply goes through. And even though much was made of that in the Western media, in fact, Iran has not done anything to give the U.S. a pretext, an excuse, a provocation, so to speak, that would allow the United States or Israel to trigger a set of military actions. Iran, I think, is also telling its people that we are not panicked. We, the Iranian government, are not panicked, that they're trying to show that they have a serenity and a calmness and a confidence, and that they will weather the storm. But in fact, economic sanctions are taking a bite on the Iranian economy right now.
There is a lot to say about this Israeli-U.S. possible attack, especially Israeli possible attack. Wall Street Journal says that the U.S. is planning a plan B should Israel attack.
I think the Israelis try to pretend that Iran constitutes an existential threat to Israel. I don't think that that, in fact, is the case, even though Iran's military has the capability to do great damage to Israel in the event of a war, even though Israel is a nuclear power. I think that the Israeli government has a pattern and a practice of invasion and bombing of its neighbors in the Middle East. It carried out the bombing of Iraq's nuclear facility in 1981, even though that was permitted by international law and subject to IAEA inspections. In other words, a nuclear program for civilian energy purposes. Israel came and bombed it. They did the same to Syria in the last few years, and they would like to carry out military strikes against the Iranian government. The Americans don't want that right now. Even though they're happy to have Iran in a state of tension, they don't really want Israel to become the main protagonist with the Iranian government by carrying out an unprovoked military strike. I mean, I'm talking about the main sectors in the American establishment, because that would then present the crisis, that struggle between the Islamic Republic of Iran on one side and the Israeli Zionist regime on the other. And in that case, Iran will be able to mobilize mass support throughout the Middle East for it. The United States has a different tack. They want to keep Israel sort of in the background, looming, endangering, threatening Iran in one way, keeping Iran in a state of tension, perhaps militarily, but have the economic sanctions do the bulk of the work by carrying out economic and financial isolation against the Iranian government. They think in the long term that's the easier way, the better way, the more effective way to carry out regime change.
The U.S. is puzzled over Israel's intentions. So what if Israel does decide to strike Iran? And this is, a U.S. official says it's hard to know what's a bluster and what's not with the Israelis.
Well, I think a lot of that is baloney and nonsense. The Israelis are the recipient, the benefactor of $3 billion a year in U.S. military aid. If they do something that's completely contrary to what Washington wants, they will be on the very short end of the stick. The Israelis are not dominating and dictating U.S. policy in this geostrategically important. They are not. They have a big influence in Washington. They have a strong lobby. But when it comes to Iran, or when it comes to Iraq, the Israelis do not tell the United States what to do. It's vice versa. If Israel strikes now, if the conflict is presented that way between the Islamic Republic and Israel, the people of the Middle East will rally to the side of Iran.
The assassination of the Iranian scientist, which Rick Santorum called half a measure, or John Bolton of the former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, the sanctions, the tightening of the sanctions, the coalition that the U.S. is trying to build against Iran. What is Iran going to do to face all of this pressure?
Well, Iran has certain allies, too. Iran has Russia, and it has China. Increasingly, it has Venezuela and Cuba. In other words, those governments in the world, in addition, of course, to Syria, which has its own problems right now, but the countries in the world that don't want the entire world to be dominated by one power, the United States of America, they recognize that the existence of Iran as an independent government is something that is positive, meaning that if the United States were to be successful in carrying out regime change in Iran, they would be emboldened to carry out further destabilizing efforts against other powers, including Russia and China, by the way, even though they're great powers. So I think that Iran has allies, and I think Iran is trying to show that they can weather the storm, and also that they can rally their population. In spite of the fact the divisions that were revealed in 2009 after the elections, the presidential elections, the Iranian people as a whole don't believe they should be sanctioned. The Iranian people believe that they have, as they do, the right to develop nuclear power for peaceful civilian purposes. And I think right now the Iranian government is trying to weather the storm. They're also making it clear that they do.
What options do they have?
They have limited options. They have limited options. And that's the big issue here, I think, is that in America right now, in the United States, nobody feels this issue. They don't feel there's a war looming. They don't feel the problem of economic sanctions. It's the Iranians who are feeling it. It's the tension, the pressure, the economic problems are all one-sided. This is like a great power, the 700-pound gorilla who decides to sit wherever it wants to sit, and it can create immense tension and pressure and economic suffering somewhere else without having to endure any political price. So that's the big problem. And as a peace activist and as someone who believes in human rights, and I think we'll see this more and more in the United States, we are starting to concentrate our efforts to expose the fact that the United States government is carrying out through a different set of tactics the same thing that they did in Iraq. They carried out regime change in Iraq, not to make Iraq more democratic, more human rights oriented, but to dominate Iraq. And I think they want to do that in Iran, and we need to have people outside of Iran stand up and say Iran should not be alone on this.
Does the presidential elections have any say in what's going on, in what's going to happen with Iran in terms of Washington, Tehran?
I think the presidential elections in the United States definitely play a role in U.S. policy towards Iran. That, by the way, has been the case ever since the Iranian Revolution. Iran has factored into American politics. In this case, the Republican candidates are sort of baiting Obama and suggesting that if Obama is reelected, we will have a nuclear-armed Iran someday soon.
Will Obama do something just to counter their statements because it's an election year?
I don't think so. I think that it's not out of the question that Obama could opportunistically up the ante or even escalate tensions or even allow some sort of limited military attack against Iran in order to show how tough he is and why he's not a liberal or something like that. But I don't think so. This is a very big project for the Pentagon, for the CIA, for the U.S. establishment. I think it goes beyond electoral politics. And I think the Obama administration and the Pentagon are having a carefully calibrated approach that won't, again, with regime change, the Republicans and Democrats share the same objective. One is more demagogically militant against Iran. They both share the same objective, which is to bring Iran back into an American sphere of influence. And I think the Republicans can't move Obama that much because Obama actually has the backing of the Pentagon in terms of this particular approach. The Pentagon is bogged down in Afghanistan. They really were pushed out of Iraq. They have a lot of military problems. A major full-scale war right now, which could happen even if they don't intend it, by people climb the escalation ladder.